Hello, welcome to Whisky Resource. My name is Mark and today I'm not doing a review. This video is a beginner's guide to the different types of whisky that you can buy, specifically Scotch whisky. So I understand that there's possibly confusion amongst those that are new to whisky about what it is exactly they're looking at when they pick up a bottle of Scottish whisky, because there's different types of whisky available. Okay, so I'm going to quickly run through what they are and then I'll give a practical demonstration that might make it easier to understand. So the first one is single malt whisky. So the easy way to look at a single malt whisky and understand what it means is that single, that refers to just one distillery. So that could be, for example, Glenfarclas. So this is a single malt. So a single malt whisky, it comes from a singular distillery. It's a malt because it has to be made using malted barley. Nothing else, a malted barley. So single malt whisky, one distillery using a malted barley. Okay. So the next one is a single grain whisky. So here we have a single grain whisky. Okay, it says so much at the bottom there, although you might not be able to fully see the text. It's a single grain whisky. So in the same way as a single malt whisky is from one distillery, so is this. This is from one distillery and it's a grain whisky. So all Scottish whisky have to have a malted barley in there. So we've got malted barley, but in addition to the malted barley, it can have a grain. Now that grain could be any other malted or unmalted grain. It could be a corn, it could be more barley, it could be unmalted barley, it could be rye. It can't just be malted barley, because then it would be single malt, but it could be malted barley and unmalted barley. So that's a single grain whisky. Okay, so the next one is this chap here, which I did a review of recently, which is a blended malt whisky. So a blended malt whisky is whisky from multiple different distilleries that are all manufactured using malted barley only, that is being blended together. Okay, so that's a blended malt whisky. And the final one is a... I haven't got a bottle with me. Oh, I do. Is this one. Okay, which is a Johnny Walker. So this is a blended Scotch whisky. So a blended Scotch whisky is a malt whisky and grain whisky from multiple distilleries blended together to create a Scotch whisky. Okay. There is one more. Unfortunately, I don't have any bottles for the last example, which is a blended grain whisky. And blended grain whisky would be grain whiskies, multiple different distilleries. It could be just two distilleries, but multiple distilleries blended together, but they can only be grain whiskies. That there gives you the 5 different types of whisky. So you've probably read that and you're probably thinking, not really any wiser as towards what each different type of whisky is. So I'm going to try and do a practical demonstration as to what we're looking at there. And I'm also going to be looking at something else regarding age of whisky. Okay? And hopefully it'll clarify out for beginners what the different types of whiskies are, and so that you'll be able to be a little bit more informed when you look to the labels of bottles in your local store or online. Okay, so I'm going to start off with single malt. So I have got a Glencairn here. It's currently empty, nothing in there. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to take this Glenfarclas 12-year-old, and I'm going to pour in not a massive pour, just a pour of this 12-year-old single malt whisky. So if you've previously been paying attention to what I've said, this 12-year-old single malt whisky It comes from one distillery, single, and that is Glenfarclas, and it is a malted barley, single malt. So here we go, 12-year-old single malt whiskey. And very nice it is. Okay, so here we have that particular whiskey. So now I'm going to take this 8-year-old Glenfarclas. Again, it's a single malt whiskey. It comes from the same distillery, which is Glenfarclas. It's a malt, a blended malt whiskey. Okay, so we've got a 12-year-old that's in this glass, and you see there's a bit of a pour there, and I'm going to pour in a tiny drop of that 8-year-old whiskey in there. So what do I have now? Well, we know that in the glass there is some 12-year-old single malt whiskey from Glenfarclas. We also know there is some 8-year-old single malt whiskey from Glenfarclas. But what do we call this? Well, this is still a single malt because only one distillery has been used. It is still a malt because both bottles are only malt whiskey, so this is still a Glenfarclas single malt whiskey. But how old is it? I put in quite a bit of 12-year-old, didn't I? Tiny bit of 8-year-old. So surely it's still 12-year-old. Well, actually no. This is now 8-year-old. This is an 8-year-old Glenfarclas single malt whiskey because the age statement goes off the youngest whiskey in the bottle, or in this case, glass. So the youngest whiskey we've got in here was 8-year-old. So now we have an 8-year-old Glenfarclas single malt. Only one distillery is being used, and it's only malt that's being put in there. Doesn't really taste much different to the 12-year-old, but the fact of the matter is, it is 8-year-old now. Now, a lot of whiskies, be it an 8-year-old, be it a 12-year-old, are actually blends from the same distillery of different barrels, and they may have a portion of the whiskey that goes into the bottle is older stock, but as soon as they put a bit of the younger stock in there, that's the age they have to go by. So hopefully that clarifies a few things about what is a single malt whiskey and clarifies a bit about age statements. So next, still using the same glass, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this Jura. So this is a Jura 10-year-old. Jura is a different distillery to the Glenfarclas. So I'm going to put a bit of this Jura 10-year-old in here. So now what do we have? Well, we've got Glenfarclas 12-year-old, we've got Glenfarclas 8-year-old, and we've got Jura 10-year-old. So how old is this? Well, it's still 8-year-old because it's the youngest whiskey that was in there was an 8-year-old. So it's 8-year-old. Is it still a single malt? Well, Jura is a single malt. The two Glenfarclases were single malts, so it's still a single malt. So this is an 8-year-old single. No, it's not. It's an 8-year-old blended malt. Okay, because we've got two distilleries have gone in there now, so we'll drop the single from the descriptor, and we say that it's an 8-year-old blended malt. It's blended because it's a blend of multiple distilleries. All it takes is two, and it has to be called a blend. It can no longer be called a single malt. Okay. So, single malts, blended malts. I'm going to put that glass aside just for the moment. I'm going to grab another glass. Okay, so we've got here a single grain whiskey, okay, which comes from the Hague Distillery. Now, this doesn't have an age statement, so we'll set that aside there. So, single grain whiskey from one distillery. It's been made using malted barley and some other form of grain. It doesn't have an age statement. Okay. Now we're going to take this one which is another Hague. It's another single grain whiskey. Doesn't have an age statement, so we don't know how old it is. And I'm going to put a bit of that in there as well. So now what do we have? Well, in the same way as that when I put the two Glenparkleses in the glass, it's the same distillery. So this is still a single grain whiskey. It's the same distillery. It has two variations of whiskey provided by the Hague distillery. So it is a Hague single grain whiskey. There's two different grain bottlings have gone in here, but it's still a single grain whiskey. Okay, so the next step would be a blended grain whiskey. Unfortunately, I don't have any other grain whiskies from any of the distilleries, but the idea would be the same as what I did with the Glenfarclas and the Jura. I would have another grain whiskey from another distillery, add that into there, and then you would have a blended grain whiskey. So that'd be fourth. Well, how about number 5? Well, number 5 is a Scotch whiskey. So Scotch whiskey would be like the Johnny Walker red label I provided earlier on. So we're going to do it using this Hague grain and this mix blend of the Glenfarclas and the Jura. So this is currently 8-year-old. This doesn't have an age statement. I know I'm sorry I'm about to commit a crime here, but mixing Hague with Glenfarclas and Jura. I'm sorry. So I'm going to put just the smallest of drops in there. That was literally just a tiny drop to try and redeem myself. Okay, so what is this now? This was an 8-year-old blended malt. Okay, that's what this was previously, an 8-year-old blended malt. But I've added in some single grain. Well, this now becomes a non-age statement blended Scotch whiskey, because I've added into here some grain whiskey that I don't know how old it is. So because we don't know how old the youngest whiskey that's in here is, it has to now be non-age statement. It's also a grain that's gone into there, so it's no longer a malt. It's got grain and malt, and that becomes Scotch. It's a blended Scotch whiskey of no age statement. And that is the 5th category of whiskey. So hopefully that's opened up a few ideas behind the different labellings that you have on bottles, and will offer some advice to what it is you're looking at. It doesn't end there. It can go a little bit deeper. So less commonly appearing on bottles now is alternate words for single malt. Single malt has in the past been known as vatted malt or pure malt. It's the same thing. It's a single malt. It comes from one distillery, and it's a malted barley. As simple as that. I think that pretty much covers as a beginner guide to the different types of whiskey. Now, in follow-up videos, I'll be covering some of the other different types of whiskey that you may come across. I'm not going to talk much more about that now. Suffice to say that, Slange, have a good evening.